So welcome to Southport Armchair History. So hopefully everybody is seeing the full screen slides. I'm Liz Fuller, and today we're going to be talking about Southport and the 1918 flu pandemic. This is the second in our five-part series on early 20th century Southport history. It's being presented in collaboration with Harper Library, and we're being supported in great measure by the Friends of the Library. Last week, we talked about World War I and how the people of Southport worked together to face the challenges that the war brought to their doorstep. This week, we're going to be talking about how they handled the flu pandemic of 1918, which was the deadliest pandemic in our country's history. So I touched on this point at the end of last week's class, but I want to say it again. Worldwide, 3 times as many people died in the 1918 flu pandemic than died in the combat during World War I. And it's nearly impossible to talk about the Spanish flu pandemic without talking about World War I, which is why we started with that topic last week. In fact, without World War I, we wouldn't even have had the flu pandemic. And that shouldn't come as a surprise because wars and illness go hand in hand. And that's something that's been known since biblical times. The 4 horsemen of the apocalypse are war, pestilence, famine, and death, and they do travel together. In fact, from the Revolutionary War up through World War I, more people died from illness than in combat in all of our major wars. So every time we had a war, more of our soldiers died from illness than they did from being killed in battle. It wasn't until World War II that we had a war in which more people died in combat than from illness. And that was largely due to the antibiotics and vaccines that had been developed by the 1940s. But the amount of death in the United States from the flu virus in the 20th century is staggering. It's nearly impossible to imagine. And in fact, in the 20th century, more people died in the United States in the 1918 flu pandemic than died in battle in all of our wars combined. So World War I, World War II, Korean War, Vietnam War, and the first Gulf Wars. Fewer people died in combat than died during this flu pandemic. So it was huge. So I'll switch to my timeline. So, all right. So here's the timeline we saw last week that I sent to you, and then I've just added a few things to it. So the top timeline covers the start of World War I in Europe in 1914, and it goes through to just past the end of the war that ended in 1918. And then the bottom line focuses on the US involvement in World War I, which just spans a little less than 2 years. Now, when people talk about the flu pandemic of 1918, they always talk about it like it was one event. But in reality, as you can see on this timeline, there were 3 waves to that pandemic. The first was in the spring of 1918, the second was in the fall of 1918, and the third was in the winter of 1919. So as we walk through these events today, keep in mind that the flu pandemic didn't just happen once. It was a series of events that took place over the course of just about a year. And during that year, the virus kept mutating and changing the ways it made people sick. So the virus in the second wave was considerably different and more deadly than the virus in the first wave. And then again, another thing to notice in the timeline is that the flu pandemic paralleled the timeline of World War I. So once again, war, pestilence, and death were all riding together. So this connection between war and disease is something that the people of Southport were intimately familiar with. The town had grown up around a fort, Fort Johnston, and then during the Civil War, 4 more forts were built nearby. There was Fort Caswell on Oak Island and Fort Holmes on Bald Head. And then just up the river were Fort Anderson and Fort Fisher. Now between wars, these forts generally had a skeleton crew with only a few people or even a single caretaker. But when the nation was gearing up for war, troops would be sent from remote locations to Fort Johnson or to Fort Caswell. And when new recruits arrived, they brought their own germs with them. And they also lacked immunity to the germs carried by others. And then before you know it, you had illness. So Southport was no stranger to epidemics. During the Mexican-American War, we had an influenza outbreak, and at the beginning of World War I, there was a measles outbreak that required a quarantine at Fort Caswell. And then during the Civil War, many refugees from Wilmington came to Southport to escape the yellow fever epidemic that was happening there. But the Spanish flu from 100 years ago was different from all the epidemics that had come before. It was a pandemic, a simultaneous worldwide infection. And it was a novel virus, which means that it had never been seen before. In just 24 weeks, as many people died from the influenza virus as died from the AIDS virus in 24 years. 675,000 people died in the US. 1 in 5 people in the world got the virus and 50 million died. Now, at that time, no one knew exactly what caused influenza, although they were starting to formulate scientific theories. When I was doing this research, it was interesting to me to learn why influenza is called influenza. Does anyone know where the word influenza came from? Okay, I'll tell you. The name started in the 1500s, they started calling it that, and it came from the Italian word for influence. And the full expression was that the illness came about because of the influence of the stars, which, especially in 1918, was as good an explanation as any, and actually I think it's still a good explanation today. It's the influence of the stars. So in the 1800s, most people and most doctors thought that disease was transmitted by bad air. But by 1918, the medical profession had finally started to accept the germ theory of disease, and most of the public had heard of it as well. Scientists had identified several bacteria and had even developed primitive vaccinations for several diseases such as smallpox, cholera, and typhoid. Now you notice those are all vaccines, so they all prevent medicine. There was nothing they could do to cure the illnesses once they started. And that's even true today for many viruses that we have vaccines for, like yellow fever. We can vaccine against it, but we can't cure it once it comes. So at the time, doctors theorized that there was such a thing as viruses, but no one had ever actually seen one. Viruses were too small to be seen by the microscopes that they had at that time. It wouldn't be until the 1930s the viruses were first seen under a microscope. And it wasn't until the 1940s that they had the first antibiotic, penicillin. And it wasn't until the 1960s that we had the first antivirals. So, you know, last week I mentioned that in some ways I thought the people of 100 years ago were a little more naive compared to people today, at least in the terms of advertising and propaganda, that they weren't as used to it because we're always surrounded by it. But in some ways, I think that they were better prepared emotionally to deal with a pandemic like the one that occurred in 1918 than we are today to deal with our current pandemic. And the reason for that is that they were used to sudden fevers and epidemics coming out of nowhere and not having any real medical options for treating them. They didn't expect antibiotics and antivirals and ventilators or even hospital beds. And we, on the other hand, have come to expect medical solutions, and we're not used to being told to rely on such things as staying at home and washing our hands a lot. We expect science to give us a cure, and we grow impatient and frustrated when it can't. So to understand how the pandemic developed in 1918 and a bit about how it's developing in 2020, it's necessary to understand a bit about how viruses work. So we're going to talk a little bit about science, very high level, and I apologize ahead of time for anyone out there, if anyone in the class is a medical professional or a scientist. If I say something incorrect, please feel free to correct me. So first, viruses are distinctly different from bacteria. They're not just like small bacteria, they're completely different organisms. Bacteria are living organisms that can grow and reproduce on their own. But viruses exist somewhere on the edge between living and dead. The most important thing to understand about viruses is they don't reproduce by themselves. They need a host cell to do that. The image on this page, by the way, the image in the circle with the purple and then the orangey footballs in it, that is an actual image of the actual 1918 flu virus. So you're looking at that, you're seeing something that no medical professional in 1918 ever saw or even imagined. Okay, now I want you to think back, I want you to think back to high school biology and remember RNA. And RNA is kind of the blueprints for the cells. So the cells all produce more cells and they have blueprints for how they do that. And the RNA tells them what to produce. So it tells liver cells, liver cell RNA tells it to produce more liver cells, and lung cells tell it to produce more lung cells. So viruses are largely just containers of their own RNA wrapped inside a protective shell. Or as I've heard it called more poetically, they're bad news wrapped in a protein. So if you look at this chart, you can see how a virus reproduces. And ignore the fact that it says coronavirus because that's just the chart I was able to find. It works the same for the influenza virus. They're both the same type. So when a virus, not the same type of virus, but they both work the same way. When a virus gets inside of a human, the first thing it does is it attaches to a host cell. So in the case of a respiratory virus, they're going to head for a lung cell. And then in step 2, you can see they enter the cell. And that's very important because now they're inside the cell. So they're hidden from our immune system. It just looks like nothing's happening here. Just keep going, move on by. And then in step 3, they get in there and they provide the RNA, they provide the blueprints to the cell and say, hey, start making some of this. And so the cell starts reproducing. It thinks it's reproducing what it's supposed to reproduce, but it's actually producing more viruses. So you see in step 4, it's producing viruses, and then in step 5, more and more. And finally, it produces so many copies that the viruses burst out of the cell, and then they go off on their own and go find more cells and start the whole cycle all over again. And each time it does that, mutations occur because it doesn't happen perfectly. So some things get changed a little bit every time it copies. And sometimes those mutations make it more effective. And so it kind of likes that and it keeps going like that because they're more effective. Okay, now, most viruses are very specific about where they live. There are viruses that affect dogs or cats or birds or horses or people. And they generally don't transmit to other species, which is why you can have a cold and you don't give it to your dog, or your dog can get kennel cough and he doesn't give it to you. We don't usually pass them back and forth. But sometimes, very rarely, viruses mutate and form a variant, and that can transfer between species. So for example, between birds and humans, or birds and swine, or swines and humans. Now, viruses are usually spread by wildlife, particularly migratory birds that travel from one location to another. So that's represented on this chart as that duck in the middle there. That's a migratory bird. And because they travel around, they can move viruses from one part of the planet to another. And sometimes that spills over to livestock. And the reason we're concerned when it spills over to livestock is because people come in contact a lot with livestock. And so from livestock, it can then spill over to humans. So if a virus changes so that it can be spill over to a human from an animal, like say from a bird to a person, that's bad, but it's not as bad because you'd have to come in direct contact with the bird. And that doesn't happen very often, so it doesn't spread like a pandemic. Now there's a special connection between humans and pigs. So you see on that chart how there's dotted lines, and then there's a solid line between humans and pigs. And that means that viruses transmit very easily between people and pigs, and that's because our immune systems are similar. So pigs can give us viruses, and we can give pigs viruses. So that transmits a little bit easier, but still, mostly that means people that work around pigs are getting exposed, and pigs are getting exposed. People that go to fairs and people that work around pigs. And when I was looking at that, I started thinking about some of these ancient cultures that prohibit people from eating pork. And I always thought it was because you know, it's hard, it's easy to get sick if something happens with, if you undercook pork, and so it's dangerous to eat. But then I was looking at it and thought, well, if viruses transmit back and forth so easily between pigs, maybe they had noticed that people got sick very easily if they were around pigs, and so it's just easier to say don't eat them, because if you don't eat them, you don't raise them, and so then that stops that in its tracks. All right, so basically that's what's happening now with the coronavirus, and that's what happened 100 years ago with what we call the Spanish flu. A virus mutated from an animal to a person, and then once it was in the person, it mutated so that it could be transmitted from person to person. And that's where it gets dangerous. Once it can go from one person to another person, then it can spread very rapidly. You don't have to you don't have to have contact with a pig. You can have a contact with the person who has the virus. And when it's a novel virus, because it was never in a human before, then we have no natural immunity to it. So it goes very rapidly from one person to another person to another person, and it spreads around. All right, I'm done with the science. Does anybody have any questions about any of that? Okay. So now that we kind of know how that works, and we know how novel viruses originate, now we're going to talk about how specifically the Spanish flu of 1918 originated. And to do that, we have to go to Kansas. You thought I was going to say Spain, right? But that's a whole other story about why it's called the Spanish flu, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But first, we're going to go to Haskell County, Kansas in the spring of 1918. So in January and February of 1918, a local doctor started noticing something. He was living in Haskell County, and people were getting sick, and it was strong, healthy people that were dying. Now, it was a very sparsely populated county. There were less than 2,000 people living there and about 600 square miles. So they didn't come in contact too closely with each other. But the doctor was very concerned about what he was seeing. And so he contacted the U.S. Public Health Service, and he said, I want you to know, I think I'm seeing something new. I think there's a new kind of flu. But it burned itself out, and it kind of died down, and nothing was really made of it. And in normal times, it really wouldn't have gotten any further, because these people had contracted in this county, but it wouldn't have spread any further, and it would have been just one of those things somebody scratched their head about. But this wasn't normal times. This was war, and there was a training camp nearby called Camp Funston, and it's now called Fort Riley, Kansas. And young men from the county were traveling back and forth to that camp. They would report for duty, and then they would go back home on leave. And this was a very big camp. It was the largest of the 16 training camps, the biggest training camps that they had in World War I. And it was used to train soldiers from military duty from all over the Midwest. And this camp had a lot of the characteristics that we talked about last week at Fort Caswell. It was overcrowded. It was a cold winter. The men all huddled together around fires and stoves. They were all packed in tightly, trying to stay warm. And they were all exposed to unfamiliar germs. So unfortunately, someone or several someones brought a novel virus with them to camp. This virus had mutated to be able to be passed from person to person. And now that we've talked about that, we all know what that means, and it's not good. So on March 4th, 1918, the first influenza case was identified at Camp Funston. Within 3 weeks, 1,100 of the 56,000 troops at the camp were sick, and 38 had died after developing pneumonia. And because men were constantly moving around from one army camp to another, the virus spread. Within 2 weeks, it had spread to 2 different camps in Georgia. And by the end of April, so a month later, it was in 24 of the 36 main camps that the Army had. So it was spread everywhere in the Army within 6 weeks. It was also spread to some of the civilian populations that were near the Army camps, because civilians come and go in and out of the camp doing business or visiting family and friends, and so they brought the disease with them. So this is a chart showing the pneumonia, influenza, and bronchitis admissions to the hospital at Fort Riley in 1918. So as you can see, it was going along pretty normally through October through February, and then boom, in March, it suddenly spiked. And the doctors didn't know what they were dealing with. They didn't know, was this a new disease or was this just a really bad season of the flu? It was just the regular flu that they saw every year, which they called the grip. Now, some doctors voiced their concerns about this spike in illness, and they felt that they shouldn't send these troops overseas while there was still this illness going around. But as you recall, from last week, when we entered the war, we had about the same number of troops as Belgium. We were around 200,000. And we had committed to sending 4 million troops, to getting together 4 million troops as quickly as possible. And so any slowdown was going to derail that, and it was going to give our allies a reason to doubt us, and it was going to give our enemies a reason to hope. So for that reason, the government decided to continue with the planned schedule to send the troops overseas despite the increase in illness. And so the men were packed tightly into troop transports and sent overseas. So we all know what happens when you put sick people on a ship. We've kind of learned that now. It's not really good. And I'm just double checking my phone, hold on. All right, having battery problems again. I don't want to do the same thing I did last week. Okay, so these men were all packed into the ship, and no one realized that they were carrying a stowaway with them. This new influenza virus was going with them. So in April, 1 month after it started in Kansas, in April, Brest, France, one of the places that these ships landed, had the flu. So it had traveled across the world in just 1 month. When the men made it to France, they were sent to the front lines, and the Western Front was mostly fought with trench warfare. And trenches were terrible places. They were terribly unsanitary places. They were ripe for causing disease. The men lived in them. They ate in them. They slept in them. They did everything in them. And of course, they died in them. And so there was terrible disease and illness in there. And then you brought in the influenza. And so it was very unsanitary, and very quickly, French, British, and German troops all got sick. So throughout April and May of 1918, the virus spread like wildfire through England, France, Spain, and Italy. So it started in March in Kansas, and now it was all the way through Europe by April and May. They estimated 3/4 of the French military was infected in the spring of 1918, and as many as half of the British troops. Now, the only fortunate thing was that this first wave of the virus wasn't particularly deadly. So people had symptoms. They had high fever and fatigue, but it usually only lasted a few days, and the mortality rates were about the same as the seasonal flu. So it ran through all the troops, and a lot of people got it, but it didn't cause that much death. Okay, so now here's the story of why we call it the Spanish flu. So if you remember last week, I talked about something called the Sedition Act. And that was the law that said that publishing or saying anything that was critical of the president or the government or the flag or purchasing Liberty bonds, saying anything about that or publishing anything about that was illegal. And that you could have pay huge fines, $10,000 fines, or you could go to prison for up to 20 years. And people did go to prison for this. They did prosecute this. So you have this illness running through the troops. And the government perceived it that if the enemy knew that our troops were sick, it would embolden them to attack us while we were weak. So talking about the flu and printing about the flu was not allowed. And the same was true in Great Britain and France and even in Germany, because the flu had also made it over to Germany. None of them wanted to publish anything about the virus or about how sick their troops were, because it was a danger to the national security. But Spain wasn't in World War I. It was neutral. So unlike its European neighbors, it didn't impose wartime censorship on the press. So while the other countries were not printing anything, Spanish journalists were free to print it, and they had a lot of the flu as well, and so they printed about it in all the papers and all the people that were sick. So what people read was just that it was happening in Spain, and so they started calling it the Spanish flu. So the name, that was the name, and it stuck. It's stuck to this day. 100 years later, people still refer to it that way, even though Spain had no more to do with it than any other European country. And in fact, they probably had less to do with spreading it than our European allies, because since the wartime governments couldn't admit there was a problem, then they also couldn't act on it. They couldn't institute quarantines or lockdowns to stop its spread. They continued to send men into military situations where they were going to be exposed to the virus. And because they didn't want to hurt the war effort by keeping factory workers and other essential civilians at home, they didn't talk about it there either. So they just kept pretending that everything was normal. So then summer came, and it seemed like the flu was going away, and people were relieved, and they were like, all right, that's good, that's over. But in retrospect, it was really only the calm before the storm. Somewhere in Europe, in all those cases that had happened, a mutated strain of the Spanish flu virus had emerged, and that had the power to kill a perfectly healthy young man or woman within 24 hours of showing the first signs of infection. So it was very common to hear stories about somebody who was just coughing for the first time in the morning and was dead by midnight. And the reason that it became so deadly is because of the circumstances of the war. And the natural life cycle of the virus had been swapped around. So normally, when people are sick, the people who are really, really sick stay in bed. They don't go anywhere because they don't feel good enough to go anywhere. And so the virus runs its course. They either live through it or they die, but there's nobody else for the virus to be transmitted to while it's doing that. And the people that have a milder strain are the ones that continue to go out into society and go to work and things like that. So that's what gets replicated, because that's what gets transmitted. But the reverse kind of happened at war, because the people who were the sickest were the ones they took out of the trenches, and took them to hospitals. And the way they got them there is they put them on trains, and then they ran the trains to the hospitals. So they were exposed to a whole bunch of people when they were being transported, and they were exposed to civilians. And so that stronger flu got more exposure and infected more people. But still then on the front lines were the people who had the less strong virus. That continued to spread as well, because we kept sending more troops up there. So everybody would have gotten it, and then they send more fresh troops in there to replace the ones who had gotten sick or the ones who'd been killed in battle, and then they would get it. And so it just kept growing and growing and growing. This newer, deadlier version, as I said, it could kill people within a couple of days, and it was a violent death. It became known as the blue death, and that was because it went into people's lungs, and there was a lack of oxygen, and it actually turned them blue. So about then the troops started returning from duty in Europe. Some of them came back to the United States, and they brought with them this new, stronger, more deadly flu. And it spread to military camps and also to the civilian population. And the government continued to try and downplay the risk of the illness, but it soon became clear that the health systems were in over their head. So here's this newspaper clipping. It says, Boston, September 17th, 16 died here in 6 hours, victims of the Spanish flu. Several hundred new cases are reported. Health officers believe they have the situation well in hand. And then in New York the same day, the number of cases of flu reported here is 184. The health officer said, no cause for alarm. So eventually the government couldn't ignore it any longer. They couldn't ignore the sickness and the death in the army camps. So finally, in October of 1918, they stopped drafting new soldiers, because they were just drafting healthy people, bringing them into the camps, and then making them sick. So they realized that just didn't make any sense. And you could say, well, October 1918, the war was almost over. Maybe they stopped the draft because of that. But actually, President Wilson had no desire to let up on drafting. He had no desire to let up on the number of men he was sending overseas, even though the Germans had made it clear that they were ready to concede. And the Army Surgeon General recommended that they stop shipping soldiers to France until the flu epidemic stopped, because they were just shipping people over there who were getting sick and dying. And President Woodrow Wilson decided against it. Over in Europe, in France, the American Expeditionary Force was on the attack and the Germans were retreating. But men were getting killed and wounded in the battles, and so the general over there, General Pershing, he kept asking for more reinforcements. And Wilson was very concerned that if he stopped the reinforcements and the convoys that were taking them over, the Germans would get some breathing room and they would start to turn instead of retreating. So they loaded up these troop ships with soldiers. Now, they did take out anybody that was obviously sick, but they would board the soldiers, and the flu had about a 2-day incubation period. So about 2 days into the trip, some of them would start getting sick, and then they would have already transmitted to other people and more and more. And it was about a 10 to 14-day journey to Europe. So these ships became, in a lot of ways, floating coffins. And they would take the soldiers and they would bury them at sea. And one man recalled in one day seeing 15 burials where they were burying men at sea as they were going across. And in addition, for every man that died in transit, there were 4 or 5 who arrived in Europe too sick to fight. So instead of being an asset to the European effort, they were actually a burden. But still, Wilson refused to stop sending men over. He really felt that it was going to ruin morale, and he said that it's true that some men died aboard ship, they died in transit, but that every such soldier who's died just as surely paid his part as his comrade who died in France. So back home, the illness continued to spread and the government continued to claim it was just the flu. They said things like, this is the ordinary flu by just another name, or you have nothing to fear, proper precautions are being taken, or we have everything well in hand. So this cartoon kind of demonstrates that. This cartoon's it was from a Dallas paper, and it's called The Mysterious Stranger. And many people believe that the Spanish influenza was just the same old grip. That's what they called the flu back then, was the grip. So you see this, this mysterious stranger coming in. He's got a cape that says Influenza Española. He's got a matador hat on, and he's going caramba, and he's holding a knife. And this man is terrified and says, who are you? And then he pulls off his cape and his hat, and he says, well, if it is an old man grip, who apparently he's not afraid of. And the old man says, discovered by heck. So it shows that they were trying to say it's just the same thing with a different name. But pretty soon they were not going to be able to deny it much longer. This is a map showing the second wave of the Spanish flu and how it spread across the country. So it first hit Boston in late August of 1918, and you can see on the map the very dark spot where Boston would be, Massachusetts, and also down in New York. And from there it moved west across the country, but it also moved south to Wilmington. And it impacted not just the military bases, but the civilian population. But even as the flu spread across the entire country, where infected 5 out of every 1,000 citizens, President Wilson never released any statement about the influenza whatsoever. The federal government did next to nothing about it. And of course, the society was different then. The expectations of government were different then. It was really expected it would be handled by local leadership. And that's why when we look at the country, we got very different responses depending on where people were. And some of it was just random luck. In some places, it seemed like the virus was more lethal than others. The earlier cities that got hit much harder. The virus seemed to continue to mutate and attenuate a little bit over time. So if you got hit later, you were in better shape. So even if you were in the same city, but you got it a little bit later in the epidemic, you were in better shape. And it wasn't because the medical care improved, because the medical care continued to deteriorate as they ran out of supplies, and the doctors got sick, and there was worse medical care as you went along, but you actually had a better chance of surviving because the flu had continued to mutate and get a little less deadly. So also, if you were in a city that got it later, so you can see further west out there, that got it later, they actually were hit less badly than the eastern coast. So it was really, the virus was the chief determinant of what was going on. Or as you've probably all heard Dr. Fauci say, you don't make the timeline, the virus makes the timeline. But even so, we can do things to influence the timeline based on our actions. And so I want to compare the actions of two different cities, Philadelphia and St. Louis. So in Philadelphia, there were indications that the virus had reached the city. There were people who had gotten sick, there were people who had died. Yet the papers continued to not say anything about it. Now the city had planned this huge Liberty Bond parade, and it was and a rally, and it was set for the end of September, and they were expecting to make a lot of money for Liberty bonds. And remember, that was one of the things that was covered by the Sedition Act. So leading doctors in town wrote letters to the editor of the newspaper, and they urged the town to cancel the parade and for people not to attend because it was a crowd disease, what they called a crowd disease. If you were around crowds, you were going to get it. But again, because of the Sedition Act, the papers did not print the letters. Philadelphia went ahead, they had the parade as planned, and 200,000 people gathered. Now, unlike the coronavirus, which has an incubation period for a couple weeks or more, the Spanish flu had a 48-hour incubation time. So 2 days after the parade, 635 people got sick. 3 days later, every bed in Philadelphia's 31 hospitals was filled with sick and dying patients infected by the Spanish flu. By the end of the week, more than 4,500 were dead in 1 week. So very quickly, Philadelphia became the city with the highest influenza death toll in the United States. The city morgue was built to hold 36 bodies, and now it was faced with the arrival of hundreds of bodies within a few days. So they put the city under quarantine, but still nearly 12,000 city residents died. So I want to compare that to St. Louis, Missouri, which was 900 miles away from Philadelphia, got the flu a little bit later and was able to kind of see what happened in Philadelphia and adjust how they handled it. So within 2 days of detecting its first cases among civilians, they instituted a quarantine. The city closed schools, playgrounds, libraries, courtrooms, even churches. They staggered work shifts so that people weren't all commuting at the same time. They restricted riding on streetcars and limited public transportation. They restricted public gatherings of more than 20 people. And so the disease spread much more slowly among the population, and the health services didn't get overwhelmed. Philadelphia had also shut down eventually, but they did it too late to flatten their curve. Okay, so Wilmington. So the flu arrived in Wilmington on September 19th, 1918. Dr. Charles Lowe, the city's leading public health official, assured everybody that they had little reason for concern, and it was just the old-fashioned grip under a new name. And so the flu moved west and south along through the state along the railroad lines, and then it moved south down the Cape Fear to Southport. Whoops, sorry. Okay, and soon it had spread all across North Carolina. So this is just a collage of different headlines as it went across North Carolina. It was everywhere, and pretty soon the government could no longer pretend that nothing was happening. People knew something was up. This was not the regular flu. So they came up with advice. They advised people to keep their distance from each other, to cover their mouths when they sneezed or coughed, and to refrain from spitting on the sidewalk, which the amount of signs and things they had to put up to tell people not to spit, it must have been a very common problem. They were also told to keep the windows open because even though people knew about germs, there was still that residual feel of bad air was a big cause of disease. And so they said, keep windows open, keep people exposed to the outside, to the sunlight, because you don't want them to be around bad air. it's interesting that one thing that they were not told to do was to wash their hands. So even though there was some understanding of the importance of hand washing, especially by doctors, it was still not completely understood. So sometimes you'll see, oh, wash your hands before you eat, but they were not told to wash their hands on a regular basis. But at last, they were beginning to understand the seriousness of the influenza. So you see this political cartoon where it says on the left, this is the way the Germans did it in France, and you've got a German soldier with a machine gun mowing down the army. And then on the right, you've got, and this is how they do, North Carolinians do it at home, and you've got a man sneezing and wiping out a whole civilian population. So they were beginning to see that this flu was dangerous, and as dangerous or more dangerous than war. So down in Southport, the officials at Fort Caswell heard about what was going on in Wilmington, and they were very concerned. So they immediately established a quarantine, and they did not allow interaction between the fort and Southport. And they even stopped the daily steamship mail stop from Wilmington. So as you can see, it was just 3 days after the flu first appeared in Wilmington that Fort Caswell went under quarantine. And one of the reasons that they were so concerned is that this flu was different than the regular seasonal flu. If you look at the green graph, and you can see it's kind of U-shaped. So most deaths, that's the regular flu, the seasonal flu. And you can see most deaths occurred on children under 5 and on adults that were over 50 or 60. That's where you got both ends. That's who usually got the flu. But this flu was different. You had the high death rate among the young children and among the older adults, but you also had this big, it was sort of a W shape. You had this big amount in the middle, and those were healthy young people that were 25, 30 years old, strong, healthy, and they were dying. And that just horrified and bewildered people. And of course, at the fort, that was very concerning because that's who they had there, were all these people. As they started to study this flu more, they decided that what was happening was when you had the young people and the old people, they were dying because their immune systems were too fragile really to put up a good fight, and so they would die. But the young, strong people were dying for a different reason, and that was because their bodies were fighting so hard. Their immune system was fighting this virus, but it got out of control. The immune system was fighting so hard that it started to destroy the body as well. And so in effect, they won the battle and lost the war because they fought off the virus, but they died in the attempt. Now, Dr. D.I. Watson was a physician in Southport. He was the acting surgeon at the U.S. Public Health Services. And a few days after the quarantine was set in Fort Caswell, he sent a letter to the paper in Wilmington asking people to not travel to Southport to avoid spreading the illness. And he said, "During the epidemic of influenza, I deem it wise to suggest to the people of Wilmington and Southport that they do not travel to and from the two places until the epidemic abates. Quarantine is impracticable, but the people themselves can keep influenza from spreading and becoming epidemic by a little thought and inconvenience. I therefore urge the people to travel as little as possible for the next few days, making very urgent business the sole object. I trust that the people of Wilmington and Southport will observe this suggestion strictly, as it will undoubtedly be of advantage in stamping out influenza, thereby benefiting Wilmington, Southport, Fort Caswell, and the surrounding country." So Southport also complied with the quarantine regulations that were being implemented across the state. The schools were closed, as was the Army-Navy Club. The Amuse You Theater was closed. The only stores that were allowed to remain open were for groceries and medications, and they had to close at 6 p.m. to avoid crowding. The county court was suspended. We were the county seat, but they suspended court. People were told to avoid crowds because this was a crowd disease, and life and business pretty much came to a standstill. So as you'll recall from last week, at that time, there was no hospital. Not only was there not a hospital in Southport, there was no hospital in all of Brunswick County. In addition, most of the doctors and nurses, like Dr. Dosher in Southport, were in the Army overseas or at Army camps fighting the illness. So across North Carolina, as the schools shut down, they asked the teachers to volunteer and act as nurses. So all across the state, towns were in desperate need of nurses, and they put out a call to any woman who could help. Now, many of the young white women who had trained as Red Cross nurses had gone away to military camps or overseas helping the troop. Now, there were also some African-American women who had trained as Red Cross nurses, and they were still at home because the US military had refused to accept them into their ranks. So when the flu came, these women were still here, they were still ready and willing to be put to work. So some towns actively sought to recruit African-American women. They put ads in the paper. Due to Jim Crow customs, they were generally only assigned to help Black patients. Officially, I find it hard to believe if people were really that sick that they held to that. I would imagine that they helped that they were put to nursing everybody, but I don't know. Officially, they were only supposed to help other African-American patients. In Southport, we know that at least one Black woman, Anna Clemens, worked with victims of the flu. Anna would have been about 30 years old when the flu came. She had worked as a teacher when she was young, and then she had trained as a nurse, and she'd been a nurse for about 9 years. She not only worked during the flu epidemic, but later she received recognition for her heroism from the state of North Carolina for her work with its victims. Again, it's not clear which families she worked with, whether they were Black families, white families, or both. In some correspondence that she left behind, she mentions having worked in homes of almost every family in Southport, which implies that she might have crossed racial boundaries. In any event, Anna and other women in Southport stepped up to fill the gap in the public health system and to nurse their neighbors back to health. And we'll be talking a little more about Anna next week in our class on women's right to vote. So the reason that nurses were so important to the treatment of the flu is that there really was very little that doctors could do for the patients. They didn't have any cures. Most of the care was to treat the symptoms, to take care of the physical and emotional needs of the patients. So, and just as we see today, patients and their families were desperate for some type of medicine, regardless of whether there was any proof that it worked. At the time, the preventive treatment for the flu, one of them was to take onions and cut the onions and then put them around the room where the sick person was, because it was believed that the onions would draw the bacteria or the virus into the onion. Sometimes they would also wear garlic or onion around their neck to keep the virus away, the illness away. Once they were sick, a very popular treatment was Vicks Vapor Rub. That had been invented a little over a decade before in Greensboro, North Carolina. And during the flu epidemic, it was hailed as an effective treatment. And in a single year, just the year of 1918, sales more than tripled from $900,000 to $2.9 million. And the stores couldn't keep it on the shelves. Now, since we are in the middle of a pandemic and it's a respiratory virus, I do want to mention that Vicks Vapor Rub actually is not effective, and it actually can be harmful for children or for people who have congestion issues, so I don't want to make it sound like I'm giving that advice. Also, onions do nothing. If somebody is sick, it does nothing to put an onion around the room, so that also is not a good thing to do. All right. So the peak of the influenza virus in North Carolina came in October of 1918, and over 5,000 citizens in North Carolina died from influenza or pneumonia associated with the disease. In Brunswick County, 35 people died. Now, amazingly, in Southport, does somebody have their mic on? I think I hear people typing or something. If you could just check your mics. In Southport, we didn't lose any of our citizens, technically. There were there were some deaths in Smithville Township surrounding Southport, but nobody actually who lived in the city limits. So this is an article that appeared in the Wilmington newspaper on November 3rd, and it's blurry, but I'll read a little bit of it to you. It says, Southport escaped lightly. Not a person died there of influenza. It says, this little city probably carries the record on the safety side in the matter of the flu, which has wrought destruction in most communities. Not a Southporter has succumbed to this terrible plague, and its worst form there has only been mild forms of the disease. So Southport fared very well in the flu pandemic, and they credited credit was given to Dr. Brown and to the physician and to the volunteer nurses. So this is in sharp contrast to Wilmington, where there were over 10,000 cases of influenza and more than 200 deaths. And in all of North Carolina, nearly 14,000 people died of influenza, which is more than 14 times the number of Tar Heels who died in combat in World War I. So that's not to say that there weren't any deaths in Southport due to influenza. There were none in the city proper of the citizens, so that was good. But at Fort Caswell, more than 500 of the 1,200 men stationed there had taken sick and been sent to the hospital. And if you remember, Fort Caswell was only built originally to house 450 men. They had expanded, but that hospital was not set up to hold 500 men. So it was a lot for them to handle. Of those 500 men, about 2% died. Most of those who died were sent back home to their hometowns to be buried. But there was one man, his name was Sergeant Robert Guy Farmer, and he was buried here at the Smithville Burial Ground. Now, Sergeant Farmer, he was only 32 years old when he died. He was married to a local girl who grew up in Southport. Her name was Katie Piver. Katie was only 24 years old when she was widowed, and she was the mother of 3 children. They were aged 3, 2, and she had an infant that was named after his father. Sadly, just 5 months after the father passed away, the baby, also named Robert Farmer, passed away. Now, the cause of death is not known for sure, but he died in March, so the timing suggests that it could have been due to the 3rd wave of influenza that swept through the United States during the winter of 1919. So both the baby, the father and son, are both buried in Smithville Cemetery. So oddly enough, there was another group of men who died at Fort Caswell during the flu epidemic. In 1918, the US government began bringing men from Puerto Rico from the sugarcane fields to Fayetteville, North Carolina to help construct Camp Bragg, or as it's now known, Fort Bragg. Now, after the Spanish-American War, Puerto Rico had become a territory of the United States, and so the government had decided to see if maybe they could get some workers from there. So they went there and they offered free transportation, free housing, affordable meals, and that they would pay them 35 cents per hour. So they brought shiploads over to work, and but the men were totally unprepared for the North Carolina weather. They didn't have appropriate clothing. They were given cramped, uninsulated housing. And when the flu pandemic arrived in October, November, many contracted the disease. And so a cemetery was established at Fort Bragg to inter these men, which later became known as the Main Post Cemetery. But they were the first men to be buried there. And also, due to the limited information that the Army had about these men, it's not clear whether their families in Puerto Rico were ever notified of their deaths or about what had happened to them. And about this time, a transport ship called the City of Savannah arrived in Wilmington with 2,000 more men from Puerto Rico on their way to work at Fort Bragg. Now, when it arrived, it was just about the time of the end of the war. It arrived on November 14th, 1918. And so the government realized, you know, we don't need them anymore. So it decided that what it was going to do was turn the ship around and send the men back to Puerto Rico, back where they came from. But before they could do that, while they were docked in Wilmington, at the port at Wilmington, influenza somehow got onto the ship and a bunch of men got sick. And so they couldn't just turn around and send them all back. So they took the 200 sickest men and they took them to the hospital at Fort Caswell, and they sent the remaining men back home. Now, the situation for these patients was worse because they didn't speak English and there was nobody around that spoke Spanish. Plus, Fort Caswell had been a segregated whites-only military base, and there were no nurses to care for these men. But amazingly, they found the perfect nurse to care for them. Her name was Lena Wright Jason. She was born in Delaware, but she had grown up in Puerto Rico. Her family was a missionary family, a Presbyterian missionary family, and they had moved there when she was a child. Lena had then become a graduate of the Presbyterian Nursing Hospital in San Juan, so she was a trained nurse. And at the time that the flu epidemic broke out, she happened to be attending an African-American women's college in Concord, North Carolina. So she saw the notices saying they desperately needed African-American nurses. So she left her studies at the school and she responded to the desperate pleas for help. And then when news of the Puerto Rican victims became known, she realized that she was in a unique position to help, and so she volunteered. She was fluent in Spanish and English, and she understood the culture of Puerto Rico. She could offer nursing care, she could offer translation assistance, and emotional connection to the sick and frightened men. And under Lena's care, the majority of the men recovered well enough to return to their homes in Puerto Rico. Sadly, 28 of the men passed away from the virus. Now, so their bodies were sent to Wilmington, where they were interred in the National Cemetery. And their markers can be identified by the words Employee USA on the inscription. So the pandemic passed very quickly in North Carolina. Did somebody have a question? No? Okay, just turn your mics off then if you don't. The pandemic passed very quickly in North Carolina. It started in September, end of September, and it was gone by the beginning of November. During that time, it killed nearly 14,000 people out of 2.5 million that lived in North Carolina. Now, it did return the following winter in the third wave, and that version of the flu was just as deadly as the second wave, but it didn't do as much harm. First, because a lot of the people had already had the illness, so they had some immunity they'd had it in the previous versions. And then second, because the war was over, people didn't travel as much, and so they didn't spread it around as much as it had gotten spread around during wartime. So the people of Brunswick and New Hanover counties, like the rest of the country, were anxious to put this ordeal behind them. It's surprising looking back how little they dwelled on it or wrote about it. They just didn't talk about it. It was as if everyone agreed it was best if it was forgotten. They had lived through the horrors of a world war and of a deadly pandemic, and they were just ready to move forward into a new era of progress and prosperity. So even though they weren't interested in looking back, the people of North Carolina were very much interested in looking forward. And the pandemic crisis had made them realize how weak the public health system was in North Carolina. One of the more significant changes that was brought about by the flu pandemic was the realization that there needed to be more emphasis on public health and that there was a need for hospitals in rural communities. So the state became very focused on this. They started programs for nurses. They put more structure around nursing, and they also had a campaign to promote rural hospitals. So when a philanthropist named James B. Duke, you may have heard of him, created a multi-million-dollar endowment to finance the development of rural hospitals. So that's really what was the springboard into action. And so Southport, as the county seat, did get the county hospital, and it was a combination of money from Duke and then also money that was raised by the people of Southport. And this hospital is the same one that you know today as Dosher Memorial Hospital. It was renamed in 1939 in honor of Dr. Dosher. And so once again, The people of Southport came together during a crisis, and they emerged stronger and more connected than before. So I just want to show you a few slides I think you might find interesting due to our current circumstances. And I find it amazing. A month ago, I bet none of us had ever seen a curved slide, a curved graph, or had any idea what one of them meant. And now we look at this and go, oh yeah, that's a curve. So these show different cities and their reactions to the virus in 1918. So the ones on the top are cities that didn't quarantined late and for shorter periods of time. So they waited until there was a definite problem and they had a shorter quarantine. And those combinations, they had a much higher death count. The ones on the bottom quarantined early and maybe longer, and they had a shorter death count. So when you think about Southport and how they handled it, they quarantined very early. I don't know if any cases had shown up in Southport when they did the quarantine. They knew what was going on in Wilmington. They realized that the two towns were very much connected. If Wilmington was in trouble, Southport would be soon. And so 3 days after it showed up in Wilmington, Fort Caswell issued a quarantine. A few days later, you had Dr. Watson sending notices, posting things in papers saying, please don't come here. Everything was shut down. So Southport reacted very quickly. The quarantine started at the end of September. It lasted until the beginning of November, so 5 or 6 weeks. When you think about a virus that had a 2-day incubation period, that's an awful lot, maybe 30 iterations or more of the virus's life cycle. So you can see, compared to the coronavirus, where it's got a 2-week incubation period, to get the comparable amount, you'd have to be shut down a lot longer. Okay, but it worked for Southport. Very low death rate. Nobody actually in the city. 2% over on Fort Caswell, and only 35 people in Brunswick County. This picture I like just because it illustrates the advances we've made in medicine in the past 100 years. The doctors on the left are looking through a microscope that's not even powerful enough to show a virus. The doctors on the right in the illustration, they're not even just looking at viruses, they're sequencing genomes of viruses in order to determine where the virus came from and how to create a vaccine. I also really like this picture because this came from a graphic novel that was published by the CDC, and it's intended for the audiences, maybe older children, young teenagers to kind of explain how viruses work and how doctors determine where they started from and all of that. But what I really like about it is because it was published by the CDC, and these doctors just look really buff, and they look like they're going to rip off those white lab coats, and they have superhero costumes on underneath. And I just am charmed by the fact that that's the way the CDC sees themselves. So this is the chart that shows the mortality rate due to infectious diseases from 1900 to 2014. As you can see, it has continued to go down and then plateau as more and more antibiotics, vaccines, and antivirals have been discovered. And the flu pandemic was really an anomaly. It's just continued to go down, and even with what they're predicting now for the coronavirus, it wouldn't be nearly what it was in 1918. It wouldn't make that big of a difference on the flow. And then this is just a chart that shows the lessons we've learned in the last 100 years about viruses. You can see we now know where they come from. We know factors that influence, like the stage of a person's life, their lifestyle, how heavy they are, how skinny they are. If they're pregnant, I wouldn't call that a lifestyle, but that's where they put that in there. If they have underlying diseases like heart disease, if it's a novel virus, or if we already have some immunity to it, if we have underlying infections, if somebody has TB or malaria, they're more at risk. Their lifestyle, if they live in cramped conditions, if they go to mass gatherings, big crowds, or if they travel a lot. Pharmaceutical interventions, you've got antibiotics, antivirals, and vaccines. And then, of course, what we're all becoming familiar with, the non-pharmaceutical interventions like masks and quarantines and washing your hands. And here's some more information. I will send this out to you. And so in case you want to do some of your own research, or follow up on some of the things I said. So I'm going to turn the